So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Inside the Room, Attorney-Diplomats at Work on the U.S. Foreign Relations, organized by the Washington Foreign Law Society, co-sponsored by ASIL, the American Society of International Law, and the ABA International Law section. This is the first of two events. The second one will be exactly 1 month in March 18, 2021, so stay tuned for the invitation and join us. I'm Juliana Canet, the president of Washington Foreign Law Society, founded in 1952 to promote the knowledge and understanding of international legal matters, comparative legal issues, and foreign law. Given the number of participants tonight, you would be muted during the panel, but you are able to communicate to us via the Q&A section. Please send us the question in addition to the one that you kindly already sent via registration link, and our distinguished panelists will get to your question toward the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded and put and uploaded shortly after the event on the Washington Foreign Law Society website. Let me introduce our speakers. Two distinguished attorneys with decades of accomplishment in foreign relations and national security affairs, in government and in private practice. Tonight, Mr. Smith will interview Mr. Feldman. They will reverse the role on March 18. You have their full bios in the invitation, and they are worth reading. Briefly, Mr. Feldman has practiced law for 60 years, including 16 at the State Department, where he was deputy and very often acting legal advisor. He teaches foreign relations law at Georgetown and is well known as one of the drafters of the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. Mr. Smith has had an exceptional career at the State Department as a lawyer, General Counsel of the Senate Armed Services Committee, General Counsel of the CIA, and a stalwart of Arnold and Porter national security practice. Most recently, he represented Ambassador William Taylor in the first Trump impeachment trial. Welcome, gentlemen, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Juliana, and welcome to my colleague and great friend, Mark Feldman, and to all of you tuning in this evening. And when Mark called me and asked me to do this, I immediately accepted and consider it a great honor to be invited to interview Mark and then to be interviewed by Mark in a month. And the purpose is for the two of us who've had many years, more than I think either of us want to count, being involved in the consideration, drafting, execution of U.S. foreign policy. And so the idea is to have us each talk about three subjects on these two evenings, that where we were fortunate to be in the position of in the room when very consequential foreign policy issues were debated, decided, and then executed. And tonight, Mark will talk, first of all, about his Vietnam, then talk about having Henry Kissinger as the Secretary of State and a client, and then the Iran hostage crisis in 1979. And the purpose is to not only try to bring you into the room, but also to give you some of our perspectives that we've developed over the years on these issues. It's also, quite frankly, to encourage our younger viewers and younger attorneys and professionals to consider public service, both for Mark and me and for many of you on this video conference tonight. It's been a special part of our lives, extremely important, and the rewards are great. So again, we encourage you to think very hard about public service. You've got Mark's bio, and Mark, I want to begin with a two-part question. One is, what attracted you to foreign policy and public service? And then secondly, when you arrived in Washington in 1965, the Vietnam War was just beginning to heat up. US combat troops would go in later that year. So what brought you to Washington, and what did you find when you got here?
Thank you very much, Jeff. And I'm so grateful to you for participating in this, and to the Society for sponsoring it. And I hope we live up to our introductions tonight. You know, like you, I've always believed in public service. And I graduated from Harvard Law School in 1960. That was the Kennedy class. JFK was at my graduation. He later became president, attracting many of my classmates to Washington and many of the faculty. And these were times, at the height of the Cold War. While I had thought about going to the State Department early on, for personal and professional reasons, I decided to cut my teeth in New York, met a woman, married her, and brought her to Washington. But the immediate reason, the timing, I was working on, I had friends in the State Department in the office of the legal advisor who were working on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the crisis in Berlin, you'll recall, resulted in the call up of the National Guard. Many of my friends were serving. These were very dramatic, intense times, and what I was doing was not nearly as interesting. And I felt that I had served an apprenticeship, and I was thinking very seriously of making that move from New York to Washington, when one day I saw the President of the United States throw his arms around John McNaughton, who had been a teacher of mine at Harvard, and he gave me the highest grade I got in law school. So, and LBJ was on camera, was putting him in charge of the war in Vietnam at the Pentagon. He had been Defense General Counsel of DOD, and now he was going to be Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, replacing Bill Bundy, who was moving over to State. So I figured he would help me. He would find a spot for me at his knee. Together we would solve the Vietnam crisis. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. And I must say, in memory of John, he died early in a plane crash in the Washington area. It was very tragic. But what happened was, the first room that I want to report to this audience, it was actually my interview with John McNaughton over the Christmas break, 1964. And I was interested in coming into government and trying to work on this seemingly intractable problem of foreign affairs. And I came and visited with him, and I found myself in the war room. The office was absolutely going crazy. He didn't have barely 5 minutes to talk to me, but he handed me over to a uniformed officer in the military service who took me around the building and elsewhere in the community. And the takeaway for this audience, this is Christmas 1964. The president had not really made the commitment, or that is to say, had not announced the commitment. We had already had the Tonkin Gulf resolution in August of that year, but no one in the country really knew what was coming. And these folks told me that the decision had been made. We were going in force. And this military officer told me, we are not prepared for this. The military, the armed forces of the United States, and the Army in particular, he was thinking about, is not trained in counterinsurgency. It will not work. We will likely fail, and they're going to blame the military for this fiasco. That was a heavy message to hear. Keep that in mind, because that's going to be a theme for this opening part of the program. Anyway, the long and the short of it is that I ended up at the legal advisor's office and started the following May 1965. And I want to say, I expect there's some people who are alumni of the office or who may even be serving in it today, that I am so grateful for the opportunity I had to serve in that office for 16 years, where I was surrounded by people like Jeff Smith, who are absolutely outstanding lawyers. And not only were they outstanding practitioners, but they were dedicated public servants. And whenever I hear somebody say the government can't do anything right and people are lazy or whatever, you hear that around the country. I am reminded of how wrong that is and how underappreciated the hardworking and really creative people are in government service, in the State Department and elsewhere. Anyway, it was a pleasure to be in the office of the legal advisor, and it defined my identity as an international lawyer, which I have carried with me through many years of practice. So the next room I was in that I want to report on was my first staff meeting with the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of East Asian Affairs. At that time, it was Marshall Green. The thing I learned there that I want to report to you is that Marshall Green and the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk at the time, believed that the war in Vietnam was China's war, started and supervised by China. There was no awareness whatsoever it was not apparent to me that there was any awareness, and I certainly was not aware of the full effect of the Sino-Soviet split. So we got off that. So here's a takeaway about lack of perception, a lack of understanding of what was going on in the theater, which could only contribute to making mistakes in the area. As I worked in the legal advisor's office on various matters involving Vietnam, including rules of engagement, research on things like the use of riot control agents, targeting in Laos, because that phase of the military campaign was being run by our ambassador, Bill Sullivan, in Laos, in coordination with the Bureau of East Asian Affairs and lawyers. Anybody who's worked in national security and government knows that lawyers work on rules of engagement and targeting and things like that. But I became increasingly concerned about the question of where did we think we were going, and how were we going to get there, as more and more troops were committed and became increasingly difficult to see how this was going to develop well. So I went and did some research, which is the kind of thing that lawyers do. And I discovered this long memo by General Maxwell Taylor and Walter Rostow of the White House had made a trip to Vietnam. And the generals, I don't recall exactly what the title was, but it might have been Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder was the operation that ultimately led to the use of B-52s for blanket bombing in North Vietnam. Anyway, the bombing of Haiphong and Hanoi and so on was a very controversial issue throughout this conflict. And what I found in this memorandum, which influenced the early decision-making in the White House, was a recognition that we were going to be forced to gradually escalate. Every escalation would be met with determination from Hanoi, resulting ultimately in the deployment of the B-52s. And finally, they would quit. So here, that of course was the fatal mistake in assessment that was made by our side. They did not quit. They had no intention of quitting. And I'll have one other insight, if you call it a story inside the room, an experience I had. You could say that this is the education of a young attorney. Gaining experience, coming in naive and gaining experience on the job. And it gets back to the question of what was our strategy, what was our counterinsurgency strategy, battle plan for Vietnam. I saw a cable coming out of Saigon, our embassy in Saigon, where one of the political officers there was reporting on our policy, which he described as one of creating refugees. and some of the logistical problems it was creating um, uh, for the situation for the embassy in Saigon for the management of our policy. And I was shocked by this because I didn't understand that to be our policy. I really don't think I understood fully what was going on the ground. And I brought that to a young man who was active at the time and became famous later on, Richard Holbrook. He and Tony Lake, who was a very brilliant, also a very brilliant Foreign Service officer at the time, called themselves super flunkies. And they went on to great responsibility in national security affairs. And I showed this to Dick Holbrook and asked him about it. And he was annoyed. He wasn't annoyed, as far as I could tell, my appreciation was that he wasn't annoyed at the policy. He was annoyed at the phrasing, which was not the kind of terminology or messaging that we wanted. Well, to come to the takeaway from all of this, and I know Jeff has encouraged me to get early in the scenario here to the core of the issues. And so I'll address some of these conclusions that I came to now, lessons learned, and then we'll talk a little bit later more about the work that I did on prisoners of war, if that's okay with you, Jeff.
Yeah.
If we have time for that. But my sense, and this is a personal perception, and there's been so much written on this subject by people, historians, military people, policymakers, much more senior than myself. But this is the way, this is how I think about it. Our military strategy, as far as I could determine, particularly in the early years before the Nixon election under General Westmoreland, was to use the children we were sending to Vietnam to fight in large numbers. I think it actually got up to 400,000, 500,000 boots on the ground at one point. When they went into combat, they were used as targets, as far as I could see, to flush out the enemy who were using guerrilla tactics that were not easy to find. So these young men would become targets, and then we would bring in the firepower and try to eliminate the enemy. And the other dimension of the policy, as I came to appreciate it, was that we were fighting the population. I'm talking about the countryside now, the peasantry, and I'm not saying all of them, but a great part of the people of Vietnam. It was a conflict between us and the North Vietnamese military was in the South and in numbers much more than we really appreciated. That is to say, we were always a few months behind in appreciating the level of organized NVN presence in the South. But a large part of our battle, the part that you saw a lot of on television, was against the armed population. So what you saw was young men burning villages, napalming villages. This is not how they were raised by their families. And the public, some of the public that tolerated it, and others rose up. It divided the country. The main takeaway from Vietnam as an experience, it had in my appreciation, the conflict, both because we failed in our mission there, but also the way we carried out our mission there became one of the most divisive events in American history, and had a gross impact on our domestic life. So it's to be regretted. So I look on this as I see the situation, my concern is we should have learned then, and it's clear in retrospect that we didn't learn sufficiently, that the United States government is not really competent to carry out a successful military operation in circumstances like these. And what are the circumstances that I'm referring to? First of all, where you have a very weak, unpopular government And the only people in the country that are really dedicated to the fight are the enemy. That's number one. We saw that in Afghanistan. We're living with that still. And the other takeaway is that we are not capable of dealing with jungle warfare. This is what the military guy, I can't remember what rank he was, told me in December 1964, that we were not trained for counterinsurgency. And I have to say that the strategy that they developed, which was based largely, and Jeff, you can correct me on this, my memory fails me, but I think it was basically drawn from what was perceived as the successful British operations in the Malay Peninsula. Was to isolate the villagers from the Viet Cong, or to prevent the Viet Cong from living off the land by separating the fish from the sea, if you want to call it that way, and they moving the population from contested territory into strategic hamlets and so on. And then you're having essentially a free fire zone throughout the country. The humanitarian cost of that was horrific, and it was not successful. And I wasn't, making those decisions. The people who were doing it were in complete good faith. They thought they were on God's side. But I think there are lessons to be learned here. Jeff, did you have any reaction to that?
Well, you're quite right. I mean, I think we fought that war with generals who had fought in World War II and thought in terms of large military forces sweeping across the plains of Europe in tanks. And that's not the jungle in essentially a political war between the North and the South, with an incompetent government in the South that didn't want to fight. And then by moving people, taking peasants off land that they had farmed forever and moving them into strategic hamlets was a disaster. And we should have known better. There were people who did know better, but they weren't the 3 and 4 stars making the decisions. Mark, you talked a lot about competence and understanding, our leaders really understanding what they were doing. But there was another element of that, which was, were they speaking truth to the American people? It goes back in many ways to the Gulf of Tonkin. But we talked a little bit about this as we were preparing, but it's really a matter of competence, and do the American people trust their government? And can you reflect on that for a minute? Because that's something we see echoing to this day.
Yeah, I think it's a more complicated, the issue of lying, the government lying to the public is a more complicated issue than people appreciate. Let's start with LBJ, because I mean the same thing, and we'll talk about George W. Bush in the context of Iraq as well. I guess the consensus now, more or less, at least in the bubbles here in Washington within the Beltway, is that LBJ misled the people, and he knew he was misleading the people, and some people say that the lack of trust or the breach of faith with the American public outweighs his enormous contributions to our domestic welfare, civil rights, immigration, the war on poverty, the Medicare, all of the rest of that. I don't share that judgment. It's not that I was a fan of LBJ in the day, not at all, but I'm sure it's true that the administration, and not just the administration, but also the military, were exaggerating their success on the ground. They certainly hid from the public the kind of numbers, but I just don't know when they came to appreciate what the extent of the quagmire that they were in. But I mean, the big picture is that the public felt betrayed because they weren't told that they were getting into a major war, and the Senate in particular, which approved the Tonkin Gulf Resolution with only, I think, 2 dissenters, took the position, Senator Fulbright, I remember well, that they were misled and that they never intended to authorize anything on this scale. I don't know that Johnson really knew where he was going, that we would end up in this terrible position. The reason it's more complicated, I think, is because the American people was constantly being told by the press. We had, unlike the more modern conflicts, the press had complete access, and people saw the coffins coming home, and you could read. It was just hard to believe, and I certainly, in the early days, had trouble believing what I was reading in the press. It took me a while to understand the extent of the horrors for our troops and for the local population that was going on there. But if you were reading the papers with any intention, you knew that it was going badly. And the other thing is the country was so divided that no matter what was said by the government, it was disbelieved. And I remember shortly before I came into the government, and to put some of the timelines on the table here, the troop commitment that I started mentioning at the very beginning was and you check me if I'm wrong, Jeff, was the Marines. I think 3 divisions of Marines were sent in March 1965, and I didn't arrive until May. And then either in May or June, an enormous escalation and our commitment, expansion of the commitment was announced. Well, sometime I think around April, because there was such a backlash to that commitment, William Jordan and others that I knew came to know and admire in the State Department put out a white paper describing the presence of NVN soldiers in the South. And I know that was criticized by the press and the public that I was reading as false, that nobody believed it. So you had that kind of a time lag. We could talk
Mark,
about.
let me, we need to move on, I think, to the next subject. But before we leave Vietnam, one of the issues that was very much a legal issue you spent a lot of time on was prisoners of war and how to treat them. And could you give us a little of the rationale and the thinking that went into those decisions?
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. I had the opportunity. Here the phone is ringing. Have to do it anyway. I had the pleasure to work with Averell Harriman as a client on prisoner of war issues. We had a major problem when North Vietnam began shooting down our pilots, and like John McCain, you all know the story of how those pilots were treated on the ground. And there were constant threats of war crimes trials, and it was a major public relations problem at home. And we had a strong desire to marshal international public opinion to protect those people from abuse. So the question was given attention, and Elle did play a considerable role in it. How should we treat the detainees who were being taken by our forces, and particularly by the South Vietnamese forces in the South? And the answer that I pushed was that the Viet Cong were an armed force. Yes, they were not following the rules of international law, rules of land warfare. They didn't have uniforms. They hid. They attacked from behind rocks. Reminds me I'm thinking of the Minutemen and the Revolutionary War and the Redcoats. But they were in combat with us. And if we expected North Vietnam to behave at all in accordance with international law, we should treat the Viet Cong detainees as if they were prisoners of war. And now, of course, the United States did not take physical custody of these individuals. They were transferred to the custody of the ARVN, the Vietnamese army. But at the instance of the United States, the Vietnamese constructed prisoner of war camps. We allowed, and in accordance, we applied the Geneva Conventions in full, and the ICRC had complete access, all the requirements that would have been required in a normal interstate conflict between regular armies. And I can tell you that this was not an easy thing to accomplish, because it was clear that we were going beyond the requirements or the traditions of the military. And I was met with a lot of resistance by the JAG. And they were really very angry. I won't tell you the names that they called me to my face, but it wasn't my influence, but I was doing the drafting for Harriman. It's quite an exciting thing for a young lawyer to sit across the man who was Roosevelt's ambassador in Moscow, governor of New York, and a presidential candidate. And he hands me a piece of paper, and I say, "I'm not sure you want to say exactly that." And he says, "Here, make it right." I mean, that can go to your head, but and I think we were right on this policy, and he had the clout to make it stick. And at the end of the day, the JAG leadership was very happy with this and took a lot of pride in it. And I take a lot of pride of being involved in as one of the technicians at the bottom of the pile on this issue, at least.
Well, Mark, we agreed to sort of limit this only because we could talk about Vietnam forever, but we've gotten a couple of questions, and let me give you one, because I think we may want to come back to it in our question and answer period at the end, because I think it comes up throughout all, frankly, my career and your career, and that is, what do you turn to for guidance when the law doesn't hold the answers to the concerns and the questions? When is the law insufficient to the problem? And that, I think, Ambassador Harriman handing you a note and say, do whatever is right. So why don't we let me let you think about that question maybe as we go to the next two, because I think it's a good one. The next subject we wanted to talk about was you had the great privilege that many of us have had of working directly with Henry Kissinger. You much more closely than I when he was Secretary of State. But he is a towering figure in our generation of foreign policy. And I'd like to, you and I talked about this a bit, but first of all, did he yell at you, and did he also listen to you?
Don't tell Jeff anything if you don't want to repeat it. Henry Kissinger was a towering figure. He was probably the most prominent, significant, for better or for worse, because he had a lot of fans and a lot of critics, a lot of great success, and some serious issues. But he was certainly the leading figure in the management of U.S. foreign relations in our lifetime, I think. And for me, it was a very exhilarating experience. I was very privileged to have the opportunity to work under him because he was a leader, and he set the tone for the government. He made things happen, for better or for worse. You had to deal with things. And what was my relationship with him? Yes, one of the emblems, one of the things that made him famous was that he had a coterie of brilliant, I don't want to say students, but the aides, I guess you would say, many of whom went on to be very, very distinguished ambassadors and secretaries in their own right. I was not one of Henry Kissinger's boys. He didn't know me. He got to know me quickly enough He knew my name because he did yell at me. I'll tell that one anecdote. I know you want me to tell one. The first time we had major briefings for him, L briefing him, and we got into a conversation in a crowded room of people. It was going the wrong way from the point of view of the legal office. And I said something in the meeting that challenged him. And shortly thereafter, we met on a social occasion. The legal advisor at the time was his previously personal lawyer, Carlisle Maw, and he was entertaining in the Watergate. And the Secretary of State came. There were a number of the people from the office were there, and Carl introduced me to the Secretary. He said, "I know him. He's the guy that's giving everybody a rough time." And Maul says, "Well, that's exactly what he's supposed to do as the lawyer." And Henry said, "Well, he's doing it very well." And that kind of sums up the relation. He yelled at me a lot, but I didn't have the sense that he dismissed me or really resented it all that much. He was a tough taskmaster. I mean, the people who worked for him, I remember one of them, I won't mention the name now, telling me of an experience. He was a speechwriter and he was a treasurer, and Henry loved him. On about the 10th draft, so goes the story. He said, he brought in the draft to the secretary, and the secretary said, "Is this the best work you can do?" And he was shy. "I'm not sure." Then take it back. He didn't even read it. Take it back and do it over again. I mean, he could be very, very tough. He had a style that was all his own. He made policy by managing the press, by speeches, by the control of information. One of the first signs of he was in the Nixon first term, he was in the White House, and he had these incredible accomplishments with the Détente program and the opening to China, the Middle East shuttle diplomacy, dramatic things. And then there was a kind of what I would call the Kissinger coup, when there was a period. One of the reasons I was acting legal advisor was because at various times is because there was this interregnum, and this was happening during Watergate, when he was manipulating behind the scenes to replace William P. Rogers, who was the Secretary of State. And during that period, we were very, very, we had very few staff. And that's when I was first promoted as an acting deputy legal advisor. Charlie Brower, whom you knew well, I think, was the acting legal advisor. And he got across purposes with someone who never received that appointment, and which I think he had richly earned. And I was on Nixon's list, I won't use the vulgar term, but the bad list. Apparently somebody in the White House thought that I was related to, or was, Meyer Feldman, who had been Kennedy's lawyer. So I was serving as the only deputy in Washington. We had, I think George Aldrich must have been out of it in some perpetual negotiation somewhere, but I was working. Charlie brought me into the front office, and I'm very grateful for that. And they wouldn't even send out an announcement saying that I was the acting deputy at that point because of the political overhang. But we worked through all of that, and eventually I became nominated as the deputy legal advisor. And I saw a lot of Kissinger because whether the legal advisor was Karl Marr or Monroe Lee, there was an awful lot of travel going on. And I had the opportunity to see him in action in his staff meetings. I would say that I want to just talk about two substantive items that are important in American history and controversial. One is the Jackson-Vanik amendment, which was the product of Scoop Jackson and Richard Pearl, and working on Jackson's staff to come to the rescue, the relief of Soviet Jewry. And as a Jew, I was very, very interested in this, in the rescue Soviet Jewry movement, and it was painful for me to hear Kissinger railing against this congressional interference in his Soviet foreign policy. But I have to say that I understood where he was coming from because I think the détente, I think his initiatives to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union, which was called détente policy, have been underestimated. I mean, it was really, I think, a very significant diplomatic move, which paved the way for the relaxation of tensions, the success of Gorbachev later on, and Reagan and others get a lot of credit for that. But I give Henry Kissinger a lot of credit for reducing the temperature in the Cold War that way. And he predicted that Congress would go too far and the Soviets would react and shut off the immigration. And it did happen that way. But I have to say that everybody listening knows that he was tone deaf when it came to human rights. That was one of the deficiencies, from my point of view, in his.
Which really takes us then to Helsinki. And if you could sort of turn to that quickly, I want to get to the Iran hostage situation for to make sure we have some time at the end. So.
Yeah, the Helsinki Accords, I'm trying to think of how much background to give. We have such a diverse audience here, and it's so long ago. But as the Cold War began to melt, there was an initiative, and I don't know who actually started it, but it may have been the Soviets started the initiative for a peace conference that would set the rules of the road for an east-west rapprochement in Europe. And there were three baskets. And the third basket, if I remember, was human rights. And what I recall about this, well, there was a lot of congressional interest in this whole program. Henry Kissinger was very suspicious of Soviet intentions. He was afraid, as I recall, that this was a Soviet ploy to perpetuate the division of Europe in the two blocks. And my timeline, I haven't really reviewed this to get the timeline right. But what I remember, what you want me to tell the group, was Henry Kissinger's instructions to his representatives, to his aides. I think George Vest was responsible for this. You may attend these meetings, but you will not speak. In the end of the day, the Congress got involved in a way that really encroached on the separation of powers. They established, ultimately it was a joint state congressional or executive congressional working body or committee that went and negotiated and administered this non-legal agreement of fundamental importance, which really had a tremendous impact in encouraging the countries in like Wallachia in Poland and so on to and helped move the liberation of Eastern Europe and ultimately the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I think he missed the boat on that, but you can't get them all right, as you say.
Well, I think I've also understood that Kissinger later on came to appreciate the value of human rights much more than he might have in those days. I do want to move to our last subject. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes on this, so that we've got a good 10 minutes for questions. But and that is the Iran hostage crisis of 1979, in which you played a very key role, and law was a prominent feature of our response to that.
Well, again, it's a question of background. I think I have to say a few words. And I'm teaching Dames and Moore, the Supreme Court case that's relevant, in the class next week, if any of my students are listening. But you know, you and I, this is branded on us. It's like yesterday, but many people don't really appreciate that this crisis, if you try to think about 9/11, the trauma that 9/11 was, this was not as consequential, but it seemed that way at the time. What happened was that on November 4, 1979, following the Iranian Revolution, which the Shah of Iran was overthrown by the people of Iran, and a radical Islamic government under Ayatollah Khomeini came to power the previous year. This didn't become a major foreign policy issue for Washington, although maybe it should have been before then, until November 4, 1979, when a group of student agitators overran the US Embassy and took control of the buildings and took as hostages all of the diplomats. I think there were 52, hostages that were in the building. This was supposedly a direct response to a reaction to the decision in the Carter administration to admit the Shah of Iran to the United States for medical treatment. That's the historical context. But what's important here is that this crisis was of enormous national significance. It created a program, a television program called Nightline, that was broadcast every night for the 444 days of this crisis. It wasn't resolved until the moment of Ronald Reagan's inauguration, when the hostages finally departed Iranian airspace. And throughout those months, and it was a difficult time for a variety of reasons for the Carter administration, but the whole nation was completely obsessed by this crisis. Originally, and it had a devastating effect on the political fortunes of the Carter administration. It became a major issue in the campaign. To be very brief about it, all negotiating efforts failed. Finally, the president authorized a rescue operation by military force. I think it was in May of 1980. It failed. There was a loss of life. Planes burned in the desert of Iran, and it was a crushing blow for the administration. And of course, Ronald Reagan rode that situation to victory in November of 1980 and took office in January of 81.
Mark, if you will permit me to interject just a personal note, that raid was led by an Army colonel named Charlie Beckwith. And then Major Beckwith had been the commander of the U.S. Army Ranger School in Florida when I went through Ranger School. And Beckwith was as good a tough a soldier as I ever knew. And when that raid failed, he literally sat down on the desert in the middle of the night and broke into tears, because their effort was to go raid to return the hostages. And it also led to the creation ultimately of the extraordinarily good special operations forces we have today. but we didn't know what to do in those days, and Beckwith led it. But you're quite right; it led to I think ultimately the loss of the presidency for Carter. But your point simply is the diplomatic effort and the legal issues associated with getting them out, and the Claims Commission, and there are a number of stories as this went on, and it came down to that last minute hurrah to get them out.
Yes, well, let me use the few minutes that we have left because I must say this enterprise to free the hostages was all-consuming for the Carter administration, and what happened was that when it was clear that no negotiations were going to prosper, we imposed sanctions. Carter issued a freeze order, which affected Iranian assets in the United States and Iranian assets in the foreign banks, American banks operating in London and Paris, and billions of dollars of Iranian assets were attached. There was a complete trade embargo, et cetera. And at one point, a decision was made. This was all to give leverage to the administration's diplomatic effort. And then, meanwhile, before and as a consequence of this crisis, the billions of dollars of American investments and contracts in Iran were wiped out, nationalized, broken. People had to come home, et cetera. So there was an enormous financial dimension to this catastrophe from the point of view of the United States community. And there was pressure on the administration to authorize litigation once you have an asset freeze administered by Treasury. There's a freeze on litigation. The administration finally moved in December of '79 to authorize litigation and really authorize the attachment of Iranian assets that were already frozen. But this was everybody in the country who had a claim brought litigation against Iran and tried to get at the head of the queue with respect to securing the judgments that they might hope to get in the U.S. courts under the newly enacted Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. So the hundreds of lawyers were involved in all the U.S. agencies, Treasury, Justice Department, the military, and so on. We pursued remedies in the World Court. Just to focus on what I was working on in the State Department was helping other agencies manage the sanctions and the litigation. And I was not involved in the World Court part of it. And when there was finally a breakthrough and the Iranians agreed to negotiate a settlement, and that was began, the first contacts, if I recall correctly, were in September 1980. And then in November, it wasn't until November of 1980 that Khomeini endorsed the process of negotiation with the United States. So we had a challenge at that time. How do you negotiate a settlement with a regime with whom you have no communication, where there's bitter enmity, a totally different worldview, and different languages, different legal systems, and you're trying to negotiate with a revolutionary, militant, bitterly anti-American authority. You're never going to sit down with them. The solution was that the government of Algeria agreed to mediate this dispute, and there was a long exchange. We don't have time to go through all of the stages of the negotiation. My particular brief in this process, working with Jerry Rosberg, whom you may remember, who was the counselor of international law, was working on a claims settlement. And the big issue which we had debated for a long time was negotiation or arbitration. And then we decided we could never negotiate in the short time that was available and we could never expect to come to an agreement on a number. I think I'm getting ahead of my story. I need to say that the objectives of the Carter administration, above all, was to obtain the safe return of the hostages with honor, without paying ransom of any kind to Iran. And there were a lot of significant demands made. But at the same time, it was part of our program to obtain compensation for all the claimants. And the long and the short of it is that while this was a disaster for the Carter administration, politically, it was the process of the claims negotiation. The results were really substantially, they were excellent. We did obtain the return of the hostages without paying ransom, and we obtained a claims settlement agreement based on binding impartial arbitration, in which was backed up by cash, by a $1 billion escrow account that would be replenished. So how do you do this? So the task of the lawyers was to draft an agreement that was sufficiently attractive, plausible for the Iranians that we could conclude a negotiation without ever meeting with them. It was quite an amazing undertaking, and the drama in this. We don't really have enough time to get into all of the details of the drama, but it was a cliffhanger. At one point, when we thought we had an agreement, this is December of 1979, suddenly at the very last minute, we have a new demand issued by the Khomeini, the Ayatollah, which asked for $24 billion from the United States, compensation for their injuries and their wounded pride, and also they had an idea that we had that the Shah had looted the treasury of Iran and that we were going to return it to them. And so at the this is Christmas of 1979, 1980, there was a thought that maybe this was done, it was over. And what President Carter decided is we can't just abandon this. Let's do what Kennedy did with Khrushchev. Let's ignore the angry letter, just ignore it and continue responding to the previous positions that they had put on the table. Let's get the Algerians to come to Washington and we'll negotiate the agreement. We just won't pay any attention to this. This is a gross oversimplification, but it happened and it worked. And it was my only opportunity to actually be in the room with the Algerians as well as with the US side. And then they were sent, President Carter sent Warren Christopher and his team, including the legal advisor Bob Owen. The first team was in Algiers for 14 days while they were negotiating this is on the run-up to the Reagan inauguration, the last days of the administration. The second team was in London working on the bank issues, which involved 5 or 6, I think somewhere around $4 to $5 billion of bank loans that were outstanding. And I was on the third team with some pretty good people like Lloyd Cutler and others who were Richard Davis of Treasury, who were here at Peter Constable of the State Department, who are here in Washington, trying to put this all through. And I think we have time for just one more inside the room. And it was a pretty exciting moment to me. And I was just rereading, there's a book published by the Council on Foreign Relations called American Hostages in Iran. And if anybody's really interested in digging into this, I recommend that book. But it reminded me that it was the night of January 20th, the night before, well, first of all, it was January 19th. There were two nights. I'm home at bed in the middle of the night. I pick up the telephone. I call the State Department Operations Center. They pass me in to this ongoing negotiation. The Iranians are not involved in this, but all the players on the US side, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Bank of England, the team in Algiers, everybody's on the phone. And I remember Warren Christopher dressing me down in this public forum for something I had sent in a secret message in a secret channel. That was very awkward. But then the issue of the night was moving the money. The deal that we had about $9 billion in Iranian assets at the end of the day. It had to be marshaled by the Fed, sent to the Bank of England, and then distributed to the Iranians simultaneously with the release of the hostages the next day. And $1 billion would be deposited in an escrow account to secure the claims process. And what happened was that the telexes, they're trying to move $9 billion by telex from the various banks to the Bank of England and to the Fed, and the telex wouldn't work. It just wasn't. And I remember Ernie Patricus was the Fed, he was the lawyer for the New York Fed who was there. How can we transfer billions of dollars? And I think what happened, what I heard was President Carter, who was on this conversation, said, the best I remember, he said, lie down and take a nap. I'm going to take care of this. And what happened, as I'm reading and refreshing my recollection in this book, is that the banks agreed that they would take these risks at the instruction of the Secretary of the Treasury. And Carter obviously gave the orders to the Secretary of the Treasury, and he gave those orders to the banks, and they agreed to accept this imperfect telex. The money was transferred, and then the hostages came home. But the Iranians, in a spiteful way, refused to release the hostages from Iranian airspace until the oath of office was taken by Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, it was. I remember that all that drama. It was. I wasn't as involved with you, but very dramatic. We just have a few minutes, maybe 8 minutes or so on my clock before we need to wrap this up. But there are really two questions, Mark, that I think I'd like you to address. One is this one of what do you do when the law isn't sufficient, or there's a conflict between the law and what U.S. policy is. So that's the sort of first question. The second question that a couple of people have asked, which is, how do I, particularly for the younger lawyers or law students, how do I get involved in international law, foreign affairs law, and national security law, because it's an area I'd like to practice in. So why don't you reflect just for a moment on what do you do when the law and our policies clash? How do you handle that? And then some advice that I'm sure your students must ask you a lot. How do I get involved in this business that we find so fascinating?
Do you want to speak to that?
I'll take, which one do you want me to answer?
The second one.
The second one. All right, I'll do that quickly. You and I have been very fortunate, but national security law has just mushroomed over the last few decades. And it now is a field practiced in certainly every major U.S. agency, the Department of Agriculture, Commerce, everybody has lawyers involved in these issues. Certainly the Department of Defense, the intelligence community as well. So there are lots of opportunities in the US government, but there are also opportunities in think tanks, in academia, in private practice, in law firms. We have a very healthy national security practice, as we call it. It's also true that any major corporation, either at the national or international level, now has lawyers who have to worry about global issues. So there are opportunities. It used to be said the only way to find them was a lot of shoe leather. Now it's just tapping a lot of electrons around and trying to find the opportunities. But they're there. And one of the exciting things about this business that we're in is that lawyers can move around. And good lawyers who work hard and have good judgment find themselves being sought out for additional responsibilities as time evolves. So I'm hopeful that this conversation and the one in a month will inspire younger people to consider this as a field.
All right, I think the larger question that is put on the table is, what about integrity, character? I know that you have a lot of thoughts, Jeff, on the importance of character in our leadership, and I think that's very important. But every lawyer in private practice and in government faces issues, not just of the professional ethics, that the way they're spelled out in the barcodes, but how do you square your conscience with things that make you uncomfortable policy-wise? If the question is when a client asks you to do something that that really is not appropriate, how do you deal with it? And I want to say to people, I had a lot of issues like that in my private practice, and I lost a number of clients. I actually fired clients who wanted me to do things, and I sometimes lost them because, particularly when you're doing voluntary disclosures and things like this, how much lying are you going to do for a client? And I'm blessed to say that I think in private practice there are a lot of lawyers who make a living lying for clients.
Yeah.
You don't need to do that in government. And my experience, at least in the State Department in our generation, was nobody asked a lawyer to lie for the government. The problem was the clients didn't want to hear the constraints, and no client likes to hear an answer that says you can't do what you want to do. And that's why Henry Kissinger was yelling at me so often, whether it was on Cyprus or or something else. And you just the risk there is being cut out of decision making, of
Yes.
becoming irrelevant in the process. And every legal advisor has to deal with that. But if you're not prepared to bring your values with you to the job, you might as well do something else. That's my concluding word on that.
Well, I think that's great. And I will wrap this up quickly, but I want to quote Thurman Arnold, the founder of Arnold and Porter. And I believe there are some Arnold and Porter folks on the phone here or on the call. Arnold had two famous sayings. One is, when in doubt, do the right thing. And his second comment was, there will come a time in the practice of law when somebody has to go to jail. Make sure it's the client. And those are witticisms, and we all giggle at them, but we confront them in our lives. And it's hard, as you say, because you need to be at the table and be recognized as a team player in order to have a voice. And that's very difficult. Like you, I never had some of the challenges in government that you face in private practice in terms of client relations. But at the end of the day, we lawyers have special responsibilities to focus our clients on these issues and try to help them understand the consequences of the course of action they're taking. And in government, I found it often worked to say, well, gee, that's a great idea, George or Bill or Sally. But, you know, if this makes it into the Washington Post, it's going to be you sitting in front of some congressional investigative committee, not me. Now, you don't say it quite that way, but that's helping them think through the consequences of their actions and the decisions, I think, is really critical. And it really goes back to what you said at the beginning, Mark, about competence of our leadership and not fully understanding the situation we were about to get in Vietnam or Iraq, for that matter, or Afghanistan, and just kind of going ahead without thinking it all the way through. That really, I think, wraps us up. Juliana, do you have any concluding comments?
Well, I would like to thank you two gentlemen. This was a wonderful evening. Thank you for the audience. We will have the recording soon in our website. Please join us in a month for the second part of this program on March 18. And check our website. We have wonderful programs. So come and join us. Thank you. Good evening.
Well, one more word. We have a minute according to this. I want to put a plug in for Jeff Smith. Jeff Smith was my guy on The Bridge of Spies. If any of you haven't seen that movie, see the movie with Tom Hanks and Mark Rylance before you come listen to Jeff Smith a month from now, because not in the Able Powers exchange, but in many exchanges afterwards, Jeff Smith was the guy on the bridge for the United States government. I was always jealous that he had that action, but he would come and tell me about it afterwards.
Well,
thanks a lot.
I look forward to that, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good evening.
Bye.